Tom, when I picture a carbon removal event, everyone, as they enter, is handed like a little tiny hand-sized direct air capture machine.
Okay.
As like a take-home little gift. Maybe it comes in a gift bag, and the gift bag is made out of carbon removed from the atmosphere.
And the food? Well, the food itself would be carbon removal anyway.
Yeah, through regenerative agricultural practices.
Totally.
And I imagine this whole event is taking place in a forest.
And the fireplace is a biochar kiln.
Yeah, the whole place is heated through the excess heat from a kiln.
That is a biochar production, yeah.
Sounds amazing. And in order to enter, you have to promise to plant 3 trees in the vicinity of this forest that you're in. We should host an event. I think we would be great at it.
I think we'd have a whale of a time. How about until then, let's see what's currently out there.
Got to scope out the competition before we build our dream event, you mean? I see.
Spot on.
Hello everyone, welcome back. It's great to be with you again. Last episode, we looked at one of the biggest moments in carbon removal right now, the Science Museum's Our Future Planet exhibition, and asked what it can teach us about having these important conversations with the public. This time, we'll be looking at another big moment for the space, but one that maybe had a little less fanfare in the general press. A little bit under the radar, perhaps.
This spring, we attended the UK's biggest greenhouse gas removal event, organised jointly by 2 major research programmes, the recently completed Greenhouse Gas Removal Programme, otherwise known as GGRA, and its successor, the Greenhouse Gas Removal Demonstrators Programme, otherwise known as GGRD. Now, they run demonstrator projects in areas such as afforestation, enhanced weathering, biochar, you know the projects I'm talking about. Now, the event was a real coming together of people from across the UK and, in fact, the world on greenhouse gas removal more broadly.
We were invited to attend this event and host a couple of talks by CORE. There's a silent 2 in the spelling of that CORE. Bonus points for anyone who can guess where it is. I'll give you a clue. They work on carbon dioxide removal. And they are the UK's national research hub on greenhouse gas removal, led by the Smith School at the University of Oxford.
And as no episode would be complete without a brief terminology clarification, as we just touched on, this event was about greenhouse gas removal, or GGR. Now, this is a slightly more all-encompassing concern than the carbon removal you'll be used to hearing us bang on about. The term can include things like methane or nitrous oxide removal, but in reality, the vast majority of the focus of existing projects is still on carbon dioxide. The question of how to deal with other greenhouse gases is an interesting one, though, so we might cover it in more detail in a future episode.
Yet another new term. It's quite exhausting, even for me. At this rate, carbon removal is going to become like the artist formerly known as Prince, and it'll just announce its presence with a symbol or a hand gesture or a wink or something. Anyway, building on the conversations we had last time about communicating this subject, we wanted to take the opportunity to ask the question, how can we get as broad a range of people actively involved in the carbon removal or greenhouse gas removal space? And what happens when all of those voices come together and start discussing the future of the industry? That sounds pretty exciting.
And remembering that this event was focusing on the UK context, I think it's also offered a great opportunity to hear about the GGR work that's happening in the UK right now. What's going on out there? Why is it having such a big moment? And what are the challenges that lie ahead?
While Tom was attending the event in person and hosted no less than 2 panel events, I was watching along online, experiencing the other side of the event, submitting questions and live tweeting. Unfortunately, I was struck down with corona and couldn't attend in person. So Tom, why don't you set the scene a little bit for us?
Happy to. So we're currently stood outside the Institution of Engineering and Technology, a very smart building, very grand, just facing the embankment on the River Thames. So I'm coming up the steps now and about to go through, enter into the building where the greenhouse gas removal event is taking place. So you can probably hear lots of chat in the background. It's really busy. Loads of faces that we've actually spoken to before for researching the show, and new faces. So it's been quite an interesting day so far. We're currently in one of the rooms, which is the Innovation Showcase room. So this is where they're showcasing projects to do with greenhouse gas removal. So one of them is the Net Zero Plus, planning the UK's new woodlands community. Then there's the carbon community for carbon sequestration studying. And then there's the actual core greenhouse gas removal hub here as well. And so it's a really bustling vibe, actually. There's people, small groups chatting. It feels like an old school event pre-COVID.
Thanks for that intro, Tom. Feels like we were really there. Tell us more about what it was like to actually be there in person.
You know what? It was actually really great being there in person. And a big thank you to the core team who invited us to come in the first place. I wanted to especially mention Philippa Westbury and George Hope, who really worked on bringing this whole event to life. Fortunately, I managed to grab them for a quick chat to get some context for the event.
I'm Philippa Westbury. I'm the stakeholder manager for the Core Hub. I'm based at the Grantham Institute at Imperial College. And recognising the importance of engaging stakeholders all the way through the progress of the research, my job is to help facilitate those connections in order to help us achieve our aims.
And I'm George Hope, Communications Manager for Core, and I'm based at the University of Oxford. And my role is to communicate high impact research and engage broadly across our communications channels with the public and lots of other stakeholders, working closely with Philippa.
What does it take to put together an event like this?
We had a wonderful starting point, which was two huge consortia. So the GGRA consortia, GGRD consortia. Together they represent this kind of wealth of academic expertise, but they also have their own networks of project partners or stakeholders who they've already kind of engaged and working in partnership with in their research. And then we also looked around to see who are doing the big kind of demonstrations of GGR technology in the country. And there is the BAYES, DAC and GGR programme, of which there are 23 projects. So that is yet more of this community, and a few other projects who also exhibited in the showcase. But also it was a bit of an experiment in who's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we came up with a communications plan to sort of reach out as widely as possible. And as Philippa said, it's very much who's out there, who wants to be part of the GGR community or who is already. And that cuts right across industry, policymakers, academia, NGOs. It's really interesting because we want to also open that out more broadly and reach a public audience. And part of our event across the 2 days was for a public audience. So we had a discussion about getting greenhouse gas removal right for people and the planet. So that really looked at what are people's concerns, what are their perspectives, what are their views on GGR, so that we can really start to diversify who we're speaking to and not just be in an academic bubble with the work that we're doing, because we really need to get out there and speak to people and make sure we get it right and innovate responsibly.
We're still learning about, who the stakeholders are. This is just really a beginning, and we still got a lot of work to do to really understand who's out there, who we haven't already connected with.
Well, we're 1 year into the project now, and we've got 3.5 years, roughly, still to go. I mean, we're aware that we're in this position where we're part of this sort of growing, burgeoning community, and we want to help get that right and reach the right people, have the right conversations. So some of that is working things out as we go and experimenting and seeing what works with different audiences and what resonates with them.
It's really good to hear that the event organisers were focused on bringing out as many people as possible, and a broad range of people as well. Carbon removal is such a huge opportunity for all of humanity, and we really do need to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to be part of the conversation.
The need to widen access to this space, including the event itself, was a bit of a recurring theme in our chats on the day. And everybody recognised it as both a work in progress and, as you'll hear, vital to the equitable development of greenhouse gas removal. But something else the conference made me realise is that there really are a lot of people working in greenhouse gas removal in the UK already, either directly or in a connected field. Obviously, in another few years, we hope that there'll be many more, But there really is this burgeoning community out there, and many people present recognize the value of bringing that community together for knowledge sharing, for creating new networks, and even just reminding themselves that they're part of something bigger.
As mentioned, I attended online. I'm just thinking that after all we've learned about remote working throughout the past couple of years, did this in-person event, asking everyone to travel to London for 2 days, did it seem justified for you here, Tom?
You're definitely right to question, but everyone we spoke to couldn't fault just how great it was to be back in person at an event with real physical people. And Steve Smith, the director of Core, told us a little about why this spot in particular seemed fitting for a GGR event right now.
I'm Steve Smith. I'm a researcher at the Smith School at the University of Oxford, no relation to the Smith who founded the school. But I am the director of CORE, which is the greenhouse gas removal research hub in the UK.
You mentioned it earlier during your talk, but it would be great to hear that framing about kind of the location and the history.
So we're here in central London, right by the River Thames on the Victoria Embankment. And that's a really interesting location for this event because it turns out the whole Victoria Embankment was built as part of the London sewer system in the 1800s. What was happening was that all the waste from the toilets of the people of London and all the waste from the industries was just flowing straight into the River Thames. And the river got in a really bad state. It was foul smelling. It was a source of disease and pollution. It became a bad habitat. It was losing species. And it got so bad there was a great stink in 1858, actually, which caused parliamentarians to not be able to function. It was just too smelly. And of course, once it affected Parliament, a decision was passed that they needed to create a new waste system. So a sewer network was built, and the Victoria Embankment is actually a key part of that sewer. So most people don't know when they're strolling around taking in the scenery around here that actually this exists as a cleanup for environmental waste. And so with greenhouse gas removal, one way to think of it is we're cleaning up the greenhouse gas waste which is accumulating in the atmosphere.
And could you then give us a very quick synopsis, like an elevator pitch of why CORE is around, what its aim is in the context of government policy and everything else?
So CORE is a research program, and it's also more than a research program, it's an engagement program. It's funded by the UK Research Councils, the public funders of research and academics in the UK. And we've got 32 experts from a range of different disciplines, all looking at this question of how we scale greenhouse gas removal as part of effective climate action. So we've got legal experts, we've got ecologists, we've got geologists, we've got systems engineers, economists, people who work on public perceptions. And really, we've got three headline aims. One is to generate and analyze a portfolio of different policy options. So how might we scale these things so that they work really effectively, equitably, sustainably, and they provide real sort of bankable business models for people to do removal. The second thing is about effective and scalable technologies. So as part of the wider program that CORE sits in, there are actually 5 demonstration projects, each trialing really innovative new removal methods. And the third thing we're doing is building the capacity in the UK. So this is an emerging sector. We don't really have a greenhouse gas removal research and development community in the UK. So this is a way of bringing people together. We're training up early career researchers. We're reaching out. We're hoping to broaden and diversify the community of people who understand these things and network with similar efforts in other countries around the world.
Now, Steve said more about the resonance of this location in his talk, about how GGR infrastructure might just become part of our world in the same way that the Victoria Embankment has. It really set the vision for the event and where the CORE hub hopes to go.
I like that analogy. It's really encouraging to think about this idea of cleanups, how they've happened in various different ways and at differing scales throughout history.
For sure. It was a neat analogy and it resonated really well with the audience on the day. So the event was actually split over 2 days. Day 1 focused on the findings from the recently completed greenhouse gas removal program. And day 2 was all about this incredibly exciting deployment of all the sorts of GGR projects that the greenhouse gas removal demonstrators program is doing. The event was also streamed online for ticket holders that couldn't attend, like our friend Emily over here.
Wish I could have been there in person, Tom.
Hey, there's always next time. And there was also loads of engagement throughout each talk with plenty of word clouds, polling questions, that sort of thing. So both in-person and online attendees had that same kind of access to engagement throughout.
The majority of the event was for ticket holders only, but in the evening of day one, there was a public event held at the venue, which was also streamed online for anyone worldwide to watch live.
Now, because this event hosted so many of the top names in GGR and many of those wanting to learn more about the space, this was just a great opportunity for us to chat with attendees about their work, about their hopes and fears, and what they think is needed really for the industry.
Among the attendees, there were many familiar faces, people we'd interviewed before or at least admired, one of which was Emily Cox, who we spoke to for season 1 of this show. She featured in our episode about public perceptions. If you haven't heard it, go back and listen. It's one of my favourites. Emily is a social science researcher with a focus on climate and environment. Tom caught up with Emily at the event.
My name's Emily. I'm a researcher at Oxford University and I work with the Core Hub. And so the thing that we're really interested in is public attitudes and the role of society really in bringing all of this forward.
How have you found the last 2 days? How's the event been?
You know, yesterday we had some really, really interesting sessions about responsible innovation and about the role of society. We had the public event last night, which was great. I was so pleased with how many questions were coming in on Slido. You know, people were dialing in on YouTube and all kinds of stuff. And so I think that kind of wider conversation is something that we really need to start doing a lot more. We need to focus on listening to people, right? We shouldn't be talking at people. We shouldn't be trying to educate them or anything like that. We need to be listening to people and really starting that two-way conversation.
You mentioned on your panel just then youth's involvement with this at COP26. Could you just give us a bit of a flavour of what you're getting from the youth on this?
Yeah, sure. And I think we just need to understand more. We need to understand better. We haven't historically engaged much with youth voices. And part of the reason for that is because as soon as you try and talk to someone under 18, your ethics application gets really complicated, right? Because they're not an adult. And so my field of social psychology in particular hasn't massively engaged with teenagers very much in the past. And so I think that's something that we really need to do more. I think we need to look specifically at those different discourses and also, using other platforms and things like that. Maybe we can see what we can learn from things that are going on TikTok and things like this. I'm hearing some quite concerning things from colleagues of mine who work in other areas of psychology, particularly like cognitive psychology, about some of the eco-anxiety that's happening at the moment amongst young people. I think it's really worrying. I think that we do have an opportunity to try and create some things that do bring some hope into this space. But at the same time, we need to be really careful not to overpromise, right? We can all get a bit carried away and, we're building up a new industry here, right? It is super exciting, but we need to make sure that we're not promising the earth if we're then not delivering.
Really interesting points from Emily here. The importance of involving youth voices is manifold. One, for the good of the movement, but also their involvement for their own good. Can being involved in the solution help with anxiety connected to the crisis? But her point of not overpromising is also vital. Finding that balance between staying realistic and being hopeful becomes particularly poignant when we're involving young people. I also think there's a balance between sharing the responsibility and not shifting the responsibility onto a younger generation. That's a potential danger as well.
Yeah, totally in agreement with what you and, other Emily are both saying here. I also got the chance to chat with Navraj Singh, the senior lecturer in climate law at Edinburgh Law School. It was great to hear the point of view of a law professional, actually, on the state of GGR today, and particularly in relating this point of diverse engagement with the field.
My name's Navraj Singh. I'm the senior lecturer in climate law at Edinburgh Law School, which is part of the University of Edinburgh. Within CORE, I am the co-legal lead, and I'm the lead on EDI, on Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, within the nascent GGR sector.
And can you give us a flavour of that kind of the work itself?
Sure. A lot of greenhouse gas removals work, quite properly, starts from the perspective of the natural sciences. So what's the scientific intervention that you need to make to capture and sequester carbon? That, of course, has a whole range of legal questions wrapped around it, often quite technologically specific. So what we've been doing, and there's a team of 4 of us, is to think about from a developer perspective or a regulator perspective or a financier's perspective, what do I need the law to do for me to make GGRs practical and scalable? So there might be things about how do we ensure that environmental goods such as air quality, water quality, soil, etc. are properly protected. It might be issues about how you support or finance development, so things like engagement with subsidy regimes or emissions trading schemes. So those are the sorts of questions that we work on.
And in terms of your background then and what's led you to joining CORE and I guess specifically GGR, how has that come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I started working on carbon capture and storage probably more than 10 years ago. And then arising out of that, did some of the early work on what was then called geoengineering. And then it all went quiet. This sort of space went quiet for quite a few years, probably about 5-6 years. And then in the last year or 18 months, GGRs have exploded as an area of scholarly work, but also in the UK, there's a lot of policy attention in this space. So a degree of policy attention, which I don't think is replicated very much elsewhere. I mean, there's a big initiative in the US, bits and pieces going on in Germany and Switzerland, but I think the very focused work that's going on in the UK policy arena at the moment is probably unique and it's extremely exciting. It's great work.
And a final question, you said that you lead on the diversity and equality and inclusion piece. How does that factor into your legal work?
And something that we've always said at the beginning of CORE is that if GGR are to become real and useful, they're going to have to be massive and very quickly. Term we often use is the GGR sector by 2050 is going to have to be the same size as the electricity generation sector is today. But it's got to do that in 28 years. So that's an entirely unprecedented trajectory of industrial development. The second aspect is that we don't want it to have all of those characteristics of discrimination and exclusion that predecessor industrial sectors have. So we're all, I think, very well familiar that the, say, heavy engineering sector has traditionally been a very male-dominant, female-exclusive sector. That's not, if we've got this extraordinary opportunity to build a new industrial sector, we don't want it to have those characteristics. So I think the first round of GGR work, perhaps for path-dependent reasons, was very male, very white. And I think as we move into a new phase of GGR development, we're seeing it being a good deal more diverse. So there are certainly more women being represented in the research community, but also in the broader policy and finance community, which I think is very positive. But I don't think you can assume that it's just going to sort itself out. It won't. I mean, it will need strategic interventions all the way along the line.
We've talked before on this show about how GGR is a new enough industry to have the potential to address issues of justice and inclusion from the outset. And it's interesting to hear a bit about the progress that's happening in this regard in the UK and to get a bit of a sense of what still needs to be done.
Yeah, it is interesting. And it feels as though, in some ways, it sort of reflects the innovative nature of the whole field. Like, we recognise that what we're trying to do with GGR, pull these gases out of the atmosphere with cutting-edge technologies, is the sort of stuff that we've never seen before. It feels really futuristic. And when we say the industry has the potential to address issues of justice, it feels like we're recognizing that the how of GGR, how we go about all this, can also look brand new. To me, it feels like that's quite a lot to put on one industry, but it also feels really exciting. This podcast is brought to you in part by Patch. Patch is the platform that powers climate action and makes it easy for businesses of all sizes to neutralise a carbon footprint or contribute to vetted, high-quality carbon removal and avoidance projects. A perfect fit for this show, don't you think, Tom?
Totally. Patch enables companies in fintech, crypto, travel, shipping, e-commerce, and more to estimate the carbon emissions of specific transactions like shipping a package and embed carbon removal directly into their products or services to account for those emissions, all with just a few lines of code. That means businesses and their end customers can be more sustainable and participate in impactful climate actions through a trusted platform.
What's more, Patch also allows companies to make purchases of vetted carbon credits directly from their platform. They find the best project developers doing the hard work of carbon removal, and companies get access to all of them in just one click. Head to patch.io/TCRS to get free access to their platform.
The event also attracted those who were looking to learn more about greenhouse gas removal and perhaps incorporate removals into their organization's net zero strategies. We were lucky enough to catch Emma Keller for her comment. She's the head of sustainability at Nestlé UK and Ireland.
I'm Emma Keller. I'm the head of sustainability for Nestlé UK and Ireland. So my job is really to develop different strategies for us to achieve our ambition for net zero emissions by 2050.
And what brings you to the GGR events yesterday and today?
So really exciting to be at the GGR event. I've come here really to listen to the experts, to hear about some of the different exciting projects that are out there, to see if there's anything we can utilise and get involved in. So it's been great to hear about the range of activities happening, but also still to get a clear picture of the challenges being faced and particularly the role of the private sector.
And Emma, what is Nestlé's take on greenhouse gas removal? Like, how critical is that going to be as part of your own net zero strategy?
So our net zero strategy is to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And on that journey, we need to get to halving our emissions by 2030 and more critically aiming for 20% reduction by 2025. Time is ticking. So absolutely a big focus, of course, is decarbonisation. And for us as a food business, we absolutely have to focus on our agricultural supply chain. It makes up more than 70% of our total emissions. So while we're really focused on genuinely transitioning towards more regenerative agriculture, we really need to look at the role of removals as well. As the world's largest food and drink company in around 186 countries, we need to look at all the tools in the toolbox, and removals is going to play a key role, particularly when you look at our footprint being in upstream supply chain.
Given what you've just said about your industry being so heavily revolved around farming and agriculture, are you looking for solutions with greenhouse gas removal, particularly in those areas, or are you kind of agnostic about what solutions that you want to potentially invest in?
At the moment, absolutely agnostic. We know where we need to go further and faster, and for us that's really around stopping deforestation. It's around moving towards regenerative practices. It's also transforming our product portfolio and the ingredients we use. But we don't know what we don't know yet. So we absolutely need to keep abreast of all the different things happening and see what we can do as the private sector, and also how we can work with our peers, with academics, with NGOs, but also with government as we go forward.
I actually find it really encouraging that representatives from such big name companies were at this event. Realistically, the true potential impact of GGR can only be realised with their full involvement.
And it was really exciting, actually, for me. You know, this industry is a big deal, and we always knew that. But having the likes of a Nestlé present at this event just shows that big money is taking it seriously too, and making this a core part of their climate strategy.
Has that call got a 2 in the middle of it, Tom?
No comment.
One of the events on day 2 was hosted by none other than Tom Proviti of the Carbon Removal Show, a celebrity in the field.
Emily, if you want my autograph, all you have to do is ask. But yes, I had the pleasure of chatting to a whole panel of experts about scaling GGR in that UK context. The session was called Green Shoots, scaling GGR rapidly, effectively, sustainably, and equitably.
Oh, that's quite a broad scope there, Tom.
It was a broad scope. I think in particular, it was also an interesting opportunity to really see what happens when you start to tackle these big existential questions around greenhouse gas removal with a group of totally different experts who are coming at this from all those various angles. First, you'll hear from Sana O'Connor-Morberg, formerly carbon dioxide removal lead at the Energy Transitions Commission. She reminded us of the wider context and what needs to be achieved globally.
And it's worth saying that Sana and also Liz, who you'll hear from shortly, were calling in online, so the audio quality isn't quite up to par. We apologise.
The Energy Transitions Commission is a global coalition of leaders from across the energy landscape committed to achieving net zero emissions by mid-century towards reaching a goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I think the Energy Transitions Commission comes into the story from a perspective that ambitious decarbonisation by mid-century is technically and economically possible. So the Energy Transition Commission, therefore the ETC, wanted to understand if such ambitious action is feasible, and we tend to be very bullish on that story, then what is the role for carbon dioxide removals in adjacent to that? First, we found that to avoid overshooting the carbon budget, the world really will need around 70 to 225 gigatons of carbon dioxide removals globally between now and 2050 in order to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And even more will be required to slower the progress of emissions reductions. Secondly, we found that a portfolio approach to carbon dioxide removal solutions is undoubtedly going to be needed, complementing nature-based approaches, but in adjacent to hybrid and more technical engineered solutions as these technologically come online later towards the second half of the century. Thirdly, we just talked about how managing risks to permanence and delivery of these removals at scale will require really robust monitoring and verification systems and secure finance. Fourth, we found that removals will need to be paid for by a combination of corporate and governmental efforts. The voluntary carbon market, for example, will not be enough on its own. And we're likely to see at least a $200 billion funding gap per year to scale removals from close to zero today. Finally, we've argued that to deliver the carbon dioxide removal necessary at scale, key policy and corporate actions must be supported as early as today in the 2020s. But we really stress the importance of business and industry working with governments because it is not one individual sector that's really going to deliver this to keep 1.5 degrees alive.
Well, Tom, I feel like she just summed up so much of season 1 of the Carbon Removal Show. Greenhouse gas removal is essential alongside serious decarbonisation. There needs to be a whole portfolio of solutions. We can't just rely on one or two. Regulation is super important in this new and complex industry. Policy and government will play a vital role alongside businesses, and it needs to start happening right now.
It's a really useful summary of the global picture. Moving specifically to a UK context and bearing in mind the scale and urgency of the removals required, we looked at some of the scale-up needs. This is going to require considerable policy attention, and when it comes to so-called engineered solutions, new infrastructure. Here's Leith Whitwam from the Aldersgate Group and Ruth Herbert, Chief Exec of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association.
So, for those of you that aren't aware of the Aldersgate Group, we're a coalition of businesses, universities and NGOs that are sort of driving towards a sustainable economy. And we have businesses essentially operating across the economy in different sectors, all the way from cement production through to food, retail and agriculture. And ultimately, there are those are, I suppose, are good examples of businesses that come 2050 won't be able to completely decarbonise all of their operations. So they absolutely need GGRs to reach net zero. I think what the progressive industry voice is saying, though, is that rather than applying them broad scale just to any sector, we need to prioritise in the first instance decarbonisation itself. So if you can reduce your emissions through greater use of recycled content, fuel switching, resource efficiency, energy efficiency and so on, that should be the priority first and foremost. And then really using GGRs where they have the highest abatement potential. Beyond that, though, I think in the last panel we had a question around what's industry doing? Is industry moving fast enough on this? I think we'll hear from Ruth in a bit around the fact that the pipeline of CCS projects is higher than the government ambition. So what we really want to see is much greater support from government to actually create the business environment that's conducive to investment so that industry can deliver. Essentially, there is massive demand, and it's just a case of being able to unlock it.
And Ruth, from the carbon transport storage perspective, give us a flavour here.
Yeah, so for those who don't know about the CCSA, we represent companies working on the deployment of carbon capture, utilisation and storage, and that includes all parts of the value chain, so the carbon capture, the transport of the CO2 and the storage. And there are a number of different applications for that, obviously. That also includes people working on engineered GHG removals, things like direct air capture, for example, with permanent storage. And as you say, we're going to need I think we're going to need about 58 million tonnes of engineered GGRs by 2050. That's what the Climate Change Committee has estimated. And let's face it, it's probably, by the time we get there, maybe we'll need more. But we have got a target within the government's net zero strategy of 5 million tonnes by 2030. The challenge at the moment is that we need to get the first bits of infrastructure away as quickly as possible. There's no point capturing it and releasing it again. We need to have this CO2 transport and storage network available so that we can have permanent storage. But obviously, the challenge at the moment with the government's working really hard to get the business models developed, to get the legislation in place. And, as Ghaleigh said, the scale of demand is huge. We did a study between February and March of the industry with our members and wider stakeholders. And there is demand for 70 million tonnes a year of CO2 capture and storage in the UK by 2030. There are that many heavy industries that want to use that technology. And, as Ghaleigh said, I think abatement at the point of emissions, so either avoiding emissions through electrification, if you can't, then using carbon capture and storage to remove emissions from the flue gas is by far more economic than taking it directly out of the air using direct air capture. However, we know that there are industries that will need direct air capture as well. But at the moment, in that pipeline that we found, there are huge amounts of energy from waste plant, biofuels plant, and cement that all can do GHG removals because they all have biogenic content. So industry is ready and raring to go with this. All of the legislation is getting put in place, and I'm confident and hopeful that that process will be smooth through the Parliament. But it's the level of ambition and the pace that we build this at that, I want to see a bit more ambition, and let's go a bit sooner with that.
There's an interesting point here on the massive demand for GGR and the challenges in delivering some of these solutions. As Ghaleigh mentioned, some industries will have an easier path to decarbonisation than others, and we therefore need to focus on GGRs where they have the highest abatement potential.
Also, reiterating Ruth's point, getting up to that 5 million tonnes of engineered removals in the UK by 2030 and 58 million tonnes by 2050 will need some significant transport and storage infrastructure if we're going to get anywhere near those numbers. However, as we know from past episodes, nature-based solutions also come with their own challenges, particularly when it comes to land. Judith Thornton of Aberystwyth University and Liz Bowles from the Soil Association talked about some of the challenges that land-based GGR from the UK faces when scaling equitably.
So equity, it's not something I'm researching. I guess I'm sat here because I live and see and feel the equity issues with this all of the time. I live in West Wales, and most of the technologies that are in the demonstrator programme are relying on land, and there's a long and very painful history of land grabbing and who owns the land, whether the English get to flood the Welsh land, whether it's power stations or wind turbines or PVs, and now it's holiday homes. There's this real tension, this is regional tension in terms of equity. And I think there's also a massive disequity in the emissions. I'm slightly amused that we're hearing how hard it is to decarbonise aviation when actually 50% of the population didn't fly in a year. So it wasn't difficult for that 50%. So the actual equity in who's doing the emitting and then who has to pay for the removals is problematic. And then I think in terms of the relationship to equity and the land, all these land-based technologies, all of this land is farmed and owned and tenanted and led by people who've been looking at this land and looking after it for generations. And we're trying to change the use of that land quite significantly, and we have to take the people who own that land with us on that journey. But we can't afford to move at the pace of the slowest. So there's a real tension between how fast we need to move and how to do that in an equitable sense.
Brilliant. Liz, maybe it would be interesting to touch on a bit more of what Judith was saying with regards to land, given your background.
Yes, absolutely. I think much is made of the ability to sequester carbon into soils and also into biomass on land. And that's clearly what's driving the land grab in many parts of the country. And I absolutely concur with Judith that farmers are very unhappy about this. But I think it's worth noting within all of this that in your introduction, Tommy made the point that agriculture and aviation are unlikely to be able to completely offset their own emissions. And that's absolutely true for agriculture, because producing food does inevitably produce some emissions. Having said that, farmers are beginning to understand how they can reduce those emissions, and increasingly they're understanding that they need to reduce emissions rather than simply sequester carbon somewhere and then sell it as an offset. In fact, this whole sort of voluntary carbon offset market, last year it was really, really hot. Those farmers thinking they could make a fortune from selling those offsets. And actually, interestingly, a lot of farmers who are farming permanent grassland, so livestock farmers, like the farmers in Wales, have thought they could be paid for carbon offsets, even though they probably already stored close to the maximum of carbon in their soils, unless they were to start planting trees. And I think there's a real sort of issue here for agriculture, that there will be potentially more opportunity for those farmers who've actually reduced the carbon in their soils to make more money out of selling carbon offsets in the future. But the one thing I really wanted to dwell on for this conference was this, really, that for farmers, in my experience, other than a small minority, the vast majority of farmers are somewhat perplexed about all the conversations about how to sequester carbon into soils, in as much as they don't know whether they should start planting trees now, because at the moment they're concerned that if they start doing things and then they have to baseline their position in 3 years' time, probably the majority of the carbon will already have been captured and they won't have been paid for that carbon capture. So there's a real sort of thirst for information and knowledge out there. And if you think about it, unlike the majority of industry where there's very large players, in the agricultural sector, it's made up of tens of thousands of SMEs. And there's currently no real clear, consistent messages being shared with farmers on what the opportunities are and actual real information that they can trust. And I think that's a real lack at the moment in this whole space of supporting farmers to do the right thing.
We've talked before about land use being a really significant piece of the puzzle for carbon removal growth. And for me, this was a useful reminder that the country and region-specific context is super important. Every part of the world comes with its own history, its own existing political tensions, and this cannot be ignored in the name of advancing carbon removal.
Have we talked about land use before, Emily?
We never shut up about land use, Tom.
Yeah, you're right. And because of their differing land use profiles and mix of industries, different regions will face different hurdles when it comes to aiming for net zero. UK legislation actually accounts for this somewhat, with some nations having more ambitious net zero targets than others. For the final section of this panel event, we moved on to questions from the audience, both in the room and online. There's just one, though, that I want to pull out for now, which is, are our targets in the UK ambitious enough?
That's an excellent question.
It is indeed, and Ruth Herbert and Laith Whitwam offered their perspectives.
I think all of these targets we just have to take them very seriously and aim to achieve them as soon as possible. I don't doubt, as we keep getting increasing reports every year from the IPCC, that we're going to probably need to do more. We're probably going to find we're going to have to go further. And so let's not wait. Let's not take a sort of slow curve up to these targets. My view would be that since we've come forward and we've discovered this demand that there is in the industrial regions, I mean, the good thing about starting in the industrial regions is that the industrial regions of the UK, they have about 50% of industrial emissions there. So, and it's a huge contribution to the country's emissions. So you can start there, and these are regions with really concentrated lots of businesses, cement, manufacturing, energy from waste, lots of different steel, other things. And you can, with quite a small network, I would say, of CO2 pipelines, and they're close to the coast where the subsea storage is, you can actually get an awful lot of emissions quite efficiently. And you're not perhaps encroaching at all on farms and things. So, let's do the low-hanging fruit first, I would say. But I fully agree, we need everything, and we definitely need to be getting some of everything done first, and then looking at the learning from that and moving as quickly as possible to these targets.
Whenever I talk about ambition, I think there's one thing around targets and commitments. The other side of the ambition that we need, and that I would say I'd be calling for when making those kinds of statements, would be for policy delivery itself. So, the wider supportive policy framework that actually then can deliver on those targets. And I noticed another question that's popped up around how can we make sure that greenhouse gas removals don't slow down actual decarbonisation activities. Funnily enough, I think one of the things that will support further rollout of greenhouse gas removal technologies is one of the things that will also make sure that we're not slowing down abatement elsewhere. So, ultimately that's about giving a really clear signal to where we're going to be using these technologies. I think this is what I was trying to get at earlier when talking about actually making sure that we use GGRs where they have the highest abatement potential. If we have clear sectoral pathways for decarbonisation, I work primarily on industrial decarbonisation, so most of my conversations are around electrification, hydrogen rollout, fuel switching, recycled material content, and so on. But one thing that different sectors compete for is all of those technologies and understanding, to what extent each of them will actually be using one of those. And that not only gives a great signal to investors around where their money will be going and creating that signal to actually invest in the tech, it gives, that kind of signal elsewhere that that's not going to be an option, or, you can't just simply continue with business as usual. And then just one last thing to add to that point, I suppose, would be making sure that we have ambitious carbon price, because that's what's going to make carbon removals cost effective. If it becomes cheaper to remove a ton of CO2 than emit it in the first place, then there's your clear business case for doing so.
Yeah, a really valid point, I think, about these current targets only being a starting point. We are inevitably going to have to do more, and we have to be ready for that.
Yeah, and as Lade said, hopefully both decarbonisation and removal can sort of support each other's growth to enable that.
Well, good job, Tom. I really enjoyed it. I was watching along online, asking questions. It really was a great session. And for all the listeners, I highly recommend going to watch the full panel talk if you found these teasers interesting. We will put the link in the show notes.
Yes, do give it a listen. And you can see me sweat up on stage.
Yummy. So, Tom, how does it feel looking back on this event now and listening again to everything that everyone had to say?
You know what? One of the things that struck me, having come away from that event and spending some time just reflecting on it, I think, was seeing how, in terms of the industry itself, it feels like this industry has exploded over lockdown and is only really now connecting in person through these sorts of events. And so it felt very lucky actually to be part of that.
That's really interesting. Like you were just diving into something that was already sort of pre-formed, but it really happened while everyone was locked up indoors. I tell you what I was reflecting on. I'm really impressed by the breadth and the scale of greenhouse gas removal activity that's already happening in the UK. We haven't really talked much about specific geography of where we live, and maybe you can hear it in our accents, but both Tom and I are UK based. And I didn't really know all this was going on. So it's really exciting for me to hear all about it and hear from the experts.
Yeah, no, totally. It's really promising. It's really cool to see our little island get really involved in this space. Something else that I'm reflecting on is how there is what feels like such an enormous demand coming through. And I guess just being cognizant of what this might mean in terms of impact on both carbon prices, also the potential opportunities that it presents, but then at the same time, making sure that we're still having a focus around decarbonisation, because that cannot be forgotten.
The demand seems to be indicative of something quite exciting, but also we really have to deal with that demand in a way that is, as we've mentioned so many times across this episode, but also previously, regulated and equitable, and that has fair land use. And all of these challenges, we brought them up so much in season 1 and they came up again in this event. And I think that in a way, it's just nice that everyone's on the same page about what the challenges are, but they are huge challenges that this industry faces.
They are big challenges indeed, but something which I also would take away from the event is the conversation is less about if now, and it's more about how. And when I say how, I mean, how are we going to be scaling these technologies, these projects, through the GGRD program, how is that deployment going to be happening? It's no longer a question of if we should be doing carbon removal or greenhouse gas removal in the first place.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see what comes out of these future programs, and it's really exciting. As well as Tom's excellent panel event, we also hosted a public event entitled Greenhouse Gas Removal, Getting It Right for People and the Planet. We're going to be releasing this as a separate episode, so stay tuned for that.
Next time, we'll also be discussing some of the themes that have cropped up in these first episodes of Season 2. We'll be reflecting on opening up the carbon removal conversation and looking at that all-important question of not just doing this, but doing it right.
Can't wait. See you then.
Bye-bye. Thanks to everyone who makes this show possible.
Our researcher and fact-checker, Henry Irvine.
Our composer, Sam Carter.
Our graphic designer, Reke Campbell.
Our content manager, Jordan Brooks.
Our guest booker, Anna DeWolf Evans.
Our editor, Mercy Barno.
Our producer, Ben Weaver Hinks.
Our project manager, Patrick Carter.
And our executive producer, Sam Floy. Thank you so much for listening to The Carbon Removal Show. Follow us on Twitter at RestoredCC. Follow us on LinkedIn at The Carbon Removal Show. And you can visit our website, restored.cc. We're all over the internet. And please remember to give us a rate and review. It really makes a difference. Thank you so much.
Co-fruition.